Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mick Wheeler. I'm a software engineer at OVO Energy, the UK's largest independent energy provider. And I'm here to tell you how you can use continuous integration with GitHub, SFDX, and CircleCI, and how it's much easier than you think. So what's the problem that we're actually trying to solve with continuous integration, or why do we even need it? I'm sure we're all familiar with change sets and used to them, and they kind of work fine. So what are we doing here? Well, there's a few problems with change sets and other methods of deployment. First of all, you don't really have a source of truth when you're using change sets between multiple orgs, because what happens if something gets changed in prod that you don't know about, that you accidentally overwrite? Where is the source of truth? Traditionally, in the Salesforce world, it's in production, but because things can be changed in there, it can easily become out of date with what you think should be the source of truth. And you don't really have a safety net. If you overwrite something in prod, a class, something like that, there's no real way to get it back. You might have a backup copy on a local machine or in a sandbox or something like that, but what happens when that disappears? And change sets, they're a manual process. You have to add all the individual items to the change set, and if you've got more than a handful, that can take quite some time, and as we're all probably aware, that's a pain in the butt. And you have to move those between environments. So if you've developed something in your developer sandbox, you've got to get that into UAT, you've got to get that into maybe an integration testing sandbox, and finally into production. There's a lot of steps that you need to follow to get your code in there. If you've got multiple people working in your org, it becomes much harder. You can very easily step on each other's toes. You can overwrite something that one of your admins has done, or they can overwrite something that you as a developer have done. And you may not even necessarily know who did what, because there's no really good way to audit these things. So how do we fix this problem, or how do we at least make our lives much easier? We're going to use continuous integration to do this. So continuous integration is a couple of things. It's both a development practice and a set of tools. So when I say development practice, I mean when you're working on a feature for your Salesforce org, you do your changes, you write your code or make your configuration changes, you check it in to a source code repository like Git. This continuous integration system will automatically verify it against your production org or wherever you would like. It will run tests. It will make sure that it's valid and working code. And you can use this to find issues with the code or with the changes that you've made early. And when I say it's a set of tools, the first one I mentioned, source code management, such as GitHub or Bitbucket or various other source code management tools that are out there. It's developer tooling, like Salesforce DX. And it's a CI pipeline or orchestration tool, like CircleCI or Jenkins or various other ones. So let's talk a little bit about source control. In this model, source control becomes the source of truth for your org. I know we're used to an org-centric source of truth in the Salesforce world, but we're moving away from that now, that your Git repository is the source of truth. That's where your code lives, and that's what's always going to be correct. A Git repository is also a safety net. Because your code is in there, because the changes are fully tracked, you can see what happened, when, where, how, and why. It's a safe place that your code can live. Things could happen in prod, things could get overwritten, something could go wrong, but you know the code in Git is always what is supposed to be there. And you can use Git branching to maintain multiple versions of your application. And by that I mean you might be working on a specific feature, so that would live in a branch. When you're finished with that feature and it's time for it to come into your production org, you would merge that branch and it becomes part of your code base. But until then, it's isolated. You can do whatever you like in there. If you break it completely, oh well, you can fix it, you can get rid of it, you can create a new branch. Branches don't have to be merged anyway. They can just be places for your little experiments if you like. Because all the changes are tracked, it makes it much easier to roll back, and it makes it much easier to review code. So if you've changed 5 lines in a class, you can easily see which 5 lines were changed and what was changed, rather than having to read through the entire thing to try and work out what somebody else did. So the next thing we need is developer tooling. So this is something that Salesforce have done a lot of work on in recent years with the advent of Salesforce DX. Tooling like this sort of existed before through the Ant deployment tools and the metadata API. But Salesforce DX is a much easier and friendlier piece of tooling that makes our life very easy when we're trying to do continuous integration. SFDX is a command line tool, so it can be scripted very easily. It makes setting up CI pipelines easy, and it makes generally managing orgs and source codes very easy. And finally, we need something to tie all of this together, and that's our continuous integration tool. So in this case, it's CircleCI, but there are other tools out there like Jenkins or Azure DevOps. And what these tools do is let you run automatic steps or scripts when things happen to your code. So when you make a change, or when you commit to a branch, or when you merge, so on and so forth, you can run automatic scripts which can move code around between different orgs, can call other things like automated testing or static code analysis, things like this. So let's set up GitHub and SFDX, and I'll sort of run you through that. So I've got my org here. This is my production org. And I've got some code on my local machine that we're going to use for this demonstration. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a repository for my code to live in. I'm going to create a new repository in GitHub. Let's call it London's Calling. And we'll make that a public repository, that's fine, and we'll hit create. So now I've got this repository, this is somewhere for my code to live. I'm going to set it up. So GitHub helpfully gives you a list of commands you can use to set your repository up. So we're just going to use those with a slight change to get our repository set up. So over here, I have my code on my local machine. I'll just click that. So if we do a little list, we can see we've got some files in force app. If you've ever used an SFDX project before, you will have seen this, but this is just where our code lives for this. So I'm going to turn this into a Git repository first. Going to initialize it. Going to add all the files. Going to commit, so push those, or get those files ready to push up to our actual Git repository on GitHub with a message. And we're going to add a remote, so we're going to tell Git where to put those files. And then finally, we're going to push those to our Git repository. Just need to enter my password in order to do that. And now our code is up in Git. So if I refresh this page, we should see all of the files here. I've got a nice little README that I've already written, and you can see all that here ready to go. So that's sort of half the battle. The code's now in Git, so at least it's somewhere. The next thing we need to do is have somewhere to work on it. So as we know with Salesforce, if we want to make any changes, we want to do anything, we need an org. So we're going to have a Scratch org for this purpose. So I'm going to go into VS Code. I've got a Lightning component here. This is part of the code. But what I'm going to do is, actually, I'll do it in the terminal, probably be easier. I'll go back into the terminal, and I will do some SFDX commands. So this first command, I'll clear the screen so it's a bit clearer, is going to create our Scratch org. So we'll give that a minute, and what it's going to do is going to create a blank Salesforce org, like a developer sandbox or a developer edition org, that has some configuration that we've specified. I've just left the defaults, but this is the org in which we're going to do our work. So now we've got this Scratch org, we need to push our code from our local machine to our Scratch org. So let's go to the command for that. Here we go, /source push. So that's going to push all the code up into our Scratch org. And that'll take just a moment. And you can see here what it's actually done. So it's gone and added a custom tab, some flexi pages, some Apex classes, and some Lightning component. So that's all in our org, and we can have a look at that if we like by going and opening that org. So we'll open that org up, and that will open a new browser window with our org. So this is a Scratch org. It was just created now. This is where, if we needed to make config changes or we wanted to look at what we've done, we would do our work. And if we have a quick look, we can see that our little hello component exists in this org. That's the one that we just created by pushing into the org. So, oops, not play from start. That was the wrong thing to do. Where are we? So what did we do? We created a Git repository. We pushed our code to it, hosted on GitHub. And then we created a new Scratch org. So this is the place where we're going to do our work. It's like a sandbox, but they have a limited lifespan. I think it's up to 30 days that you can have a Scratch org for. If you need a new one, you can simply create a new one. There is limits on how many that you can create per day and how many each org can have, but the number's quite high, especially if you've got quite a small team. So the next thing we need to do is set up CircleCI. So this is where the magic happens, so to speak. This is where the automation happens. So we're going to switch back to our browser. I'm already in CircleCI, and I'm going to add a project. So we're going to find, just reload this so it re-looks. Here we go. Here's our London's Calling repo that we just set up. We're going to set up a project. Now, the first time we do this, it is going to attempt to run the build. And we haven't done any configuration yet, so this isn't going to work. So once this is loaded, I'm just going to cancel that initial build and walk you through the configuration that we need to set, that we need to change and what we need to do in order to make this work. If it would hurry up and finish. While we're doing that, let's go into our configuration file. So what CircleCI does is essentially just run a list of commands that we give it off the back of an action. So, for example, if we want to run a build, we need to install any dependencies. In this case, it's like SFDX. We need that in order to work. We want to create a Scratch org, so a fresh org that we can test our work against. And then we want to validate our components and run all tests. So what that will do is push our code into that Scratch org, run all the tests to make sure it works, and give us a result at the end. But we can have many of these. So this is the build one. This happens every time you make a commit to Git. But we can have a deploy to prod one. So this one does the similar thing, except it only happens on a certain branch. In this case, it's only on our master branch. Our build job only runs on every other branch that is not master. So this configuration file, while it looks a little bit scary, it's fairly straightforward. In this Git repository, there are all these little shell scripts that do these various tasks, but you can write commands straight in here if it's much simpler what you're trying to do. So let's go back and see if we're ready. Yep, we're ready. So we'll start building. Now we'll cancel this build. So now what we need to do is tell Circle how to talk to Salesforce, because we haven't told it anything yet. So let's go into our settings. Let's go into our environment variables. Now this is where you tell Circle how to access your Salesforce org. As you can understand, these pieces of information are secret. This is how you're telling CircleCI how to access your org. So you don't want to put that in your Git repository where potentially other developers or the whole world, if it's a public repo, could see. You definitely don't want to do that. So that's why these live in this environment variables space. So the other thing we need in order to make this work before I add these environment variables is a connected app. So I've already created this connected app because they take up to 10 minutes to provision, and I don't want to sit here waiting and wasting your time for 10 minutes while that happens. So I've created this connected app ahead of time, and it gives me a key. I also need to provide it with a certificate. I've created a certificate ahead of time and uploaded it into this connected app. So what we're going to do now is using the values from the connected app, the consumer key, the certificate, and my username, we're going to set up Circle so it can talk to Salesforce. So let's add a variable. Now I've got these here in my, where are we? In my notes. So we're going to add the server key first. So let's put that in there and give it the name, SFDX server key. We're going to, so this is what we've generated ahead of time. We're going to add the client ID. This is what's in our connected app. And finally, we're going to add the username. So this is the user which Circle is going to use to log into your org. Now, normally, you would want this user to be a separate integration user, but in this case, it's a demo, so I'm just using the main user. So we've added this. So what we can do now is go back to our projects. and we can rerun this build. So let's rerun that. So we can see what jobs are in this, and we can see what it's doing. So if we go into here, the first thing it's going to do is set up an environment. It's going to check out our code from Git. It's going to install any dependencies. Now, this takes the most amount of time, and you can cache this, but for the purposes of this demonstration, it just installs the dependencies every time. There's quite a lot of advanced things that you can do with Circle that are outside the scope of this talk, but their documentation is excellent, and you can read through that if you want to progress with this. So we're installing our dependencies. That looks like it's nearly done. We'll let that finish. Oh, here we go. It's logging into production. It's deploying to production. And it should soon tell me that it's in progress. And hopefully, in a second, it will have finished and tell me that it is deployed. So now, in my production org, I should be able to see this little hello app. Now, it says hello from Bristol currently. So what do we do when we want to make a change to our code? What's the process there? So we'll go back to VS Code, and we'll go into our little Lightning component that says hello from Bristol. This is the Lightning component that you can now see in production. I'm going to go ahead and create a new branch. So you can do this either through the command line or through VS Code. Let's call it LDNS call. That will do. And let's create it from our master. So now we're on a new branch where we can experiment and do whatever we like. So let's change this to London. And we'll save it. So what we can now do is, Git hasn't wanted to work, so that's all right. We'll just do it from the command line instead. So you can see we're on the London's calling branch, so we will do git add the files that we've changed, git commit -m, m is for message. Whoops. There we go. That will now push it up to Git. Okay, that's done. So if we go back into GitHub, we can have a look that we've got our London's calling branch, and we can create a pull request to compare what we've got in our branch to what we have in production. So let's go ahead and create that pull request. So now we can see exactly what I've changed. This obviously would be more than one file generally, but you can see the change here, red for what was there, green for what is there now. And the good thing about pull requests is you can have conversations, you can go back and forward on changes, this sort of collaboration works really well when you're in a team, when you've got other people reviewing your code. And you can see now that it's running our Circle build to make sure that this code is valid. You can set it up so that Git won't even let you merge branches or won't let you do anything until this is finished. So let's go and see what's happening with that. So it's created our Scratch org in order to validate this against. It's just added all of the stuff to our Scratch org. It's added all the changes that we've made. So we'll let that finish. And there we go. It looks like it's run successfully. It's told me that all the tests have run. So if I go back to Git, I can see that our tests have passed. So let's go ahead and merge that pull request. Now, what this is going to do, and this is one of the great things about continuous integration once you've got it set up, when I click on this button, it's going to send our pull request, it's going to merge our pull request into master, which, as you saw from the configuration earlier, is going to automatically deploy it to production. So clicking this button will automatically deploy these changes to prod. So let's go and see. We should see another Circle job running. We can see that it's running now. So once again, it's installing its dependencies. It's going to run all of our tests. It's going to deploy the changes to production. So we'll just wait for that to run. While we're waiting, we'll go back into VS Code and we'll just take a look at some of the scripts in a little bit more detail. For example, what we're doing here, deploying to production. So simple shell script, just a list of commands essentially that we're running, converting it to metadata API format, and then we're deploying it to production, telling it to run all the tests in the org. Fairly simple. This actually could be directly in the config file, but you can comment it and make it sort of obvious what it's doing when it's in shell scripts. Let's go back to Circle and see if our job's finished yet. Looks like it has. So finally, hopefully if this has all gone right, when I refresh this, it should say hello from London because we're in our production org. And there it is. So that is continuous integration. So let's go back to our slides. So what did we do? We told Circle the repository that we wanted to use. We chose the London's calling one. We told it how to get into Salesforce. That was those environment variables. And then we configured it. With that config file, we told it what happens when we commit to master, what happens when we commit to any other branch. And we told it what branch, master, that we wish to use for production. So we've done the key takeaways. So the whole point of this is CI is not as hard as you think. There's a couple of things that are omitted in this talk because they take a while to run, such as creating the connected app. But I set up a continuous integration setup in 20 minutes. Anybody can get started in this, with this in under a day. Even if you're kind of unfamiliar with the command line or you're a little bit nervous, all of this stuff is so well documented. And there was a session earlier on Git for admins. That was a good session about the Git portion of this. But all of this stuff is so well documented online that it's not that difficult to get going. Basic continuous integration tools like GitHub, like CircleCI, like SFDX, all of these are free to get started with. GitHub is free to use. SFDX comes with Salesforce. Circle allows you to have one container for free. So if you're just working by yourself, that's enough. And a little bit of time spent setting this up will make your life much easier. Clicking that one merge button to deploy to prod, instead of having to go through and create a change set and all the fun that comes with that, is much quicker and easier once you've got it set up than trying to use things the old way. And you also get all of the excellent code review tools and the ability to see what's happened with your code as part of using source control. Here's some resources and links if you'd like. I did this talk at Dreamforce last year, so that's why the repository says Dreamforce 2018. But all of the code used today, all of the configuration, and all of the stuff you need to get started is available in that GitHub repo. So you could just clone that, move your source code in there, and that would be a basic CI setup ready to go. You don't even have to follow a lot of the steps that I've followed in this talk. But thank you so much. And if you've got any questions, I will be up the back to answer them.